The Battle of Little Bighorn, famously referred to as Custer's Last Stand, stands as a pivotal moment in American history. This fierce confrontation unfolded between June 25th and June 26th, 1876, near the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. It marked a dramatic clash between the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, and the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. One key figure in the lead-up to this significant battle was Mitch Boyer, a scout of mixed heritage whose insights proved invaluable. His deep understanding of the local terrain and Native American strategies allowed the U.S. Army to gain crucial intelligence. Boyer's first-hand observations shed light on the intricate dynamics of the conflict, providing a unique perspective on the events that transpired. The journey toward this fateful confrontation began on June 22nd, when Custer's unit departed from the mouth of the Rosebud River at noon. After marching approximately 12 miles, they set up camp for the night. The next day, June 23rd, the troops broke camp early at 5 a.m. and continued their trek along the Rosebud, progressing until 9 a.m. At this point, they came across a significant lodgepole trail, estimated to be about 10 days old, which they would follow until evening. Custer, known for his boldness and tactical aggression, must have sensed a pressing opportunity here, as these trails often indicated a sizable nearby encampment. On the morning of June 24th, the regiment set out again at 5 a.m., covering a distance of about 5 or 6 miles. During this leg of the journey, they encountered 6 Crow Indian scouts, dispatched by General Custer the night before to locate the Indian village. These scouts reported fresh pony tracks, indicating that the trail ahead was still active, approximately 10 miles away. Custer convened his officers, although the details of their discussions remain unknown. Nevertheless, the scouts were sent ahead at a brisk pace. Although officially just scouts, these Crow allies bore personal stakes in the battle. They viewed the Sioux as traditional enemies, and assisting Custer meant weakening these longtime foes. By around 4 p.m., the unit reached a site where the village had been just a few days earlier, and they established camp 2 miles downstream from the Rosebud Forks. Once more, the scouts set out to search for the village. Later that night, at 11 p.m., Custer ordered the troops to pack up, directing them to follow the scouts up the right-hand fork of the Rosebud River. As dawn broke, the soldiers set up camp again, brewing coffee, and shortly after sunrise, the scouts reported that they had spotted the village from a ridge overlooking the Rosebud. The scene must have appeared ominous. Miles of thick smoke plumes curling up from the distant horizon, a sure sign of thousands of campfires ahead. As they advanced up the creek, they took cover in a ravine. From their vantage point, it was about 3 miles to the summit of the divide, where the scouts claimed the village was visible. After ensuring his troops were concealed, Custer rode ahead with a few orderlies to survey the Indian camp. Within an hour, he returned, stating he could not locate the village. However, Boyer and the scouts maintained they could see it about 15 miles away. As Custer continued his search, the scouts brought back urgent news that they had been spotted, and word was rapidly spreading among the villagers regarding the approach of Custer's troops. Another scout warned that 2 Sioux war parties had crept close to observe the command. The discovery of fresh pony tracks in a nearby ravine confirmed their suspicions. Custer likely realized the immediacy of the threat, but chose to advance. His characteristically bold approach, perhaps strengthened by past victories against seemingly overwhelming numbers. In light of this information, Custer gathered his officers, issued orders, and prepared his troops for battle. The scouts were dispatched ahead, and the regiment advanced steadily. After traveling approximately 3 miles, the scouts signaled the presence of Indians up ahead, and the unit followed their lead along a small creek, which was a tributary of the Little Horn River. After covering about 6 miles, they spotted an Indian lodge in the distance, prompting Custer to quicken the pace. Upon reaching the lodge, they encountered an abandoned Indian camp. Finding all but one of the lodges had recently been vacated. The silence around the lodge was likely unsettling, as if the echoes of a bustling village had suddenly faded, signaling the larger force nearby. Upon entering the last lodge, they found the body of a deceased Indian. From their vantage point, they could see into the Little Horn Valley and observe dense clouds of dust rising about 5 miles away. Many among Custer's ranks interpreted this as a sign of retreat by the Indians, bolstering Custer's confidence to launch an attack. He promptly sent a message to Colonel Reno, who was leading 3 companies of the 7th Cavalry, instructing him to advance quickly with the scouts toward the source of the dust. Reno galloped his men down the creek bottom for 3 miles, reaching the confluence with the Little Horn River, where they discovered a natural ford. Despite the warnings from scouts about the large numbers of approaching Sioux, Reno opted to proceed and cross the river. He subsequently arranged his companies in battle formation on the prairie and began to advance. The valley extended approximately 3 to 4 miles wide, flanked by low, rounded hills to the left, and a river bottom dense with cottonwood trees and shrubs to the right. Reno's skirmishers opened fire following intermittent shots from the hills and a few from the river bottom. He led his men approximately a mile from the ford to a line of timber on the right, where they dismounted to confront the enemy on foot. The horses were sent into the timber, while the soldiers organized on the prairie and advanced toward the Indians. The Sioux, riding their ponies, charged across the prairie and unleashed a torrent of gunfire at the soldiers. After several minutes of fierce exchange, Reno retreated back to his horses in the timber. The Sioux maneuvered to his left and rear, seemingly intending to cut off his escape route to the ford. Reno ordered his men to mount and ride through the timber. Just as they were mounting, the Sioux, who had advanced within the timber, fired at close range, fatally wounding one soldier. Colonel Reno then instructed his men to dismount again, but he quickly reversed the order, urging them to remount and charge onto the open prairie. The command made a direct line for the ford, closely pursued by a large contingent of Sioux warriors. As the pace intensified, it erupted into a full sprint toward the ford. The Sioux, riding swiftly on their ponies, attacked the soldiers, resulting in casualties among both men and horses. The soldiers faced little resistance, spiraling into a chaotic retreat toward the ford. The sight of warriors bearing down upon them, armed with rifles, arrows, and clubs, must have been terrifying as they tried to evade capture and survive. I wasn't there to witness the events at the ford, so I cannot provide specific details. But I do know many soldiers fell during the exodus from the timber. Just as I was riding out, my horse stumbled and threw me off before bolting away, following Reno's command. I spotted several soldiers dismounted, either due to their horses being killed or having fled. Some soldiers remained mounted, but there were about 13 of us altogether. Seeing no other options, I called on them to join me in the timber where we could defend ourselves against the Indians. 3 of the soldiers were injured, 2 of whom were in such bad shape they could not use their arms. Despite their desire to escape, I insisted that we stay put. I explained that reaching the ford was not feasible, and we had wounded men who needed our help. Some soldiers still wanted to leave, but I assured them that, as an experienced frontiersman familiar with Indian tactics, I could guide us through the situation. I reminded them that this was no worse than previous hardships I had faced. About half of the men were on horseback and wanted to keep their mounts, but I urged them to leave the horses behind and fight on foot. We concealed ourselves in the bushes for about 3 hours, during which time I could hear the intense sounds of gunfire downstream, roughly 2 miles away. I was unsure who was engaged in the conflict, but it was clear our men were embroiled in skirmishes with the Indians. Later, I discovered it was Custer's command. The fighting with Custer lasted nearly an hour before the heavy gunfire diminished, with many of the Indians in the upper part of the valley retreating downriver. As the shooting quieted downstream, I urged my comrades, "Let's go! Now's our chance to escape." However, most chose to wait for nightfall. I warned them that the Indians might return and proposed we leave immediately. 11 out of the 13 agreed to follow me, while 2 opted to remain behind. I organized the men into skirmishers, and we advanced on foot toward the river. As we approached the river, we encountered 5 Indians on horseback, and they opened fire. We returned fire, causing the Indians to withdraw, and then we crossed the river, which reached about chest deep. We made it across, including the injured, and proceeded to Reno's command, which I could see about a mile away on the riverbank bluffs. We reached Reno's position safely after about 15 minutes. There, I noticed the Indians advancing up the valley from Custer's battle. At that point, Reno began moving his entire command down the ridge toward Custer's location. The Indians, arriving from all directions, crossed the river below Reno and surged up the hill. After engaging in skirmishes, Reno returned to his previous position on one of the highest points along the bluffs. By this time, it was around 5 p.m., and the battle continued until it became too dark to see or fire accurately. As darkness fell, Reno removed the packs and saddles from the mules and horses to create makeshift breastworks. He dragged dead horses and mules into place to provide cover for the men. Some of the soldiers used their knives to dig shallow rifle pits, remaining armed and alert throughout the night. At dawn, the Indians initiated a heavy barrage, leading to a fierce battle that lasted until around 10 a.m. The Indians attempted to charge our position several times, even coming close enough to hurl stones at our men. Captain Benteen commanded his soldiers to charge on foot and disperse the large number of Indians gathering to attack. Benteen led the charge, catching the Indians by surprise and inflicting significant casualties. They were clearly taken aback by this bold tactic. In the midst of fierce combat, Benteen exhibited remarkable bravery, moving fearlessly amidst the hail of bullets. He continuously encouraged the soldiers to hold their ground and resist the Indians' advances. It is worth noting that around 10 a.m., shortly after Benteen's assault commenced, the soldiers began desperately calling for water. Many had gone without hydration for 36 hours, and the intense heat of battle had left their throats parched and dry. Some had swollen tongues and could hardly speak. They attempted to eat crackers and hardtack, but their mouths were too dry to moisten. A few resorted to chewing grass, but it stuck to their lips, making it difficult for them to spit or articulate clearly. Reports emerged that the wounded were succumbing to dehydration, prompting several soldiers to volunteer to fetch water from the river, even at the risk of their lives. A valley sloped down from the battlefield along the river's edge, while we were engaged in combat on the bluffs about 700 yards from the river. To reach the head of the ravine, the men had to sprint across an open stretch of about 100 yards, which lay under the watchful eyes of the Indians positioned on the bluffs. Despite the dangers, around 50 soldiers dashed across the open terrain and entered the ravine. They hurried toward the mouth of the ravine, only to discover it was heavily guarded by a group of Indians stationed in the timber on the opposite side of the river. Although they could approach the water within 30 feet under cover, stepping onto the riverbank would expose them to Indian gunfire. Nevertheless, the soldiers bravely navigated this hazardous stretch. Some rushed to the river with canteens, filled them, and sought refuge in the bend of the ravine behind the rocks, where they could safely transport the canteens back up the hill. Tragically, before all the men and wounded could be resupplied, one soldier was killed, and 6 or 7 others were wounded during this daring effort. One soldier had his leg shattered by a bullet, necessitating amputation later on. By around 2 p.m., the Indians began withdrawing but continued skirmishing until late afternoon. As nightfall approached, the Indians retreated completely. At last, we managed to secure water for the animals, many of which were close to death, and they were allowed to graze on the hillside. That evening, Colonel Reno moved his position to a higher and more fortified area, strengthening their defenses compared to the previous location. Anticipating that the Indians would resume their attacks the following day, we were surprised when morning came without any sign of them. Confidence grew that Crook or Terry would come to our aid, prompting Colonel Reno to send messengers. Around 10 a.m., we received the uplifting news that General Terry, accompanied by a sizable force, was advancing up the valley just 6 miles away, and soon the leading elements of his troops became visible. I joined the scouts on the left side of Reno's formation. Our group comprised around 60 individuals, including 35 Re-Indians, 6 friendly Sioux, 6 Crows, and a handful of white men. I witnessed a bloody scout raise his arm and collapse. I suspect he was killed. The 2 cavalry soldiers I left in the woods when I departed have likely perished, as they haven't been seen since. I spotted Lieutenant McIntosh shortly after he was hit. His horse was shot from under him early in the skirmish, and when he was killed, he was riding another soldier's horse. He was shot on the riverbank while making his way back toward the ford. I also saw Lieutenant Hodson. His horse was shot, injuring him near the opposite bank of the ford. His horse tumbled into the river, and to pull himself up the steep bank, Hodson grabbed onto a horse's tail, managing to climb up. However, as he reached the bank, an Indian sharpshooter shot him down. Among the remains were Custer's packs, which the Indians did not seize, nor did they capture any mules. Most of Custer's horses were shot during the battle, and I doubt the Indians captured more than 100 animals during the conflict. I believe some of our men were taken captive and suffered torture. I witnessed the scout Isaiah Dorman enduring torture, having small pistol balls lodged in his legs from the knees down. likely inflicted while he was still alive. Another man had strips of skin carved from his body. Groups of women and elderly Indians roamed the battlefield, crying out in grief. Many victims bore knife wounds, and some had their noses and other body parts severed. The Sioux camp contained the severed heads of 4 white soldiers, though their bodies were nowhere to be found on the battlefield or in the village. While our soldiers did not kill any women, it is possible that some of the scouts did. Bodies of several women were discovered in the nearby ravine. I estimate that the Indian village housed around 6,000 individuals, with approximately 3,000 of them being warriors. The Indians initially engaged Reno's forces before confronting Custer, later returning to engage Reno again. The same group of warriors participated in all the assaults. I believe Sitting Bull personally led the warriors, alongside 8 or 9 other chiefs present on the battlefield. I witnessed 5 chiefs, each waving a flag to rally their troops. Some flags were red, while others were yellow, white, blue, and one was black. All the chiefs skillfully managed their warriors during the battle. I believe Crazy Horse and his contingent were involved in the fighting. The Indians likely suffered casualties comparable to those of Custer's men. The soldiers fought valiantly and inflicted heavy losses on the Indians. It is widely believed that none of Custer's troops survived. They were completely surrounded by at least 2,500 warriors on all sides. The sheer numbers and the organized assault of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors overwhelmed Custer's men, who fought valiantly but could not withstand the unrelenting attack. The soldiers were scattered across the hillside in small groups, each holding their position as best they could. Ammunition was rapidly depleted, and as the final shots rang out, the silence that followed marked the end of Custer's command. The battlefield was left littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, their equipment scattered amidst the grass. For the Native American tribes, the victory was both triumphant and somber, as many of their own warriors had also perished in the fight to protect their homeland. In the following days, tribal members performed ceremonies and mourned their losses as the magnitude of the conflict settled over the valley. For the Plains tribes, Little Bighorn would be remembered as a hard-won defense of their land, even as they anticipated the fierce retaliation that would inevitably follow.